traditional well goes straight up and down. We've been doing that for 100 years. And actually what we do now really reduces our environmental footprint significantly. And it's not just the hydraulic fracturing. Really, this is key. And our opponents have not opposed this. They can't see why. But this is really what made the big difference, one of the two things. Big factor, horizontal drilling. I'm going to walk all the way up there and just kind of point it out real quick. So instead of going up and down, we're now able to go down about 10,000 feet, a couple miles, and then kick out. And we can extract resources all along that at 2 miles below the ground. And it really makes a huge difference in where we've gone. It's rewritten the textbooks about American energy. Remember about 10, 15 years ago we said it was all over? And it's just changed that completely. That combined with hydraulic fracturing. So Jennifer's going to talk about this, I think, as well. But we've been doing exploration and production in our state for a long time. Most Floridians do not realize that we discovered an oil because the governor and cabinet created a prize for the discovery of oil in the early 40s. It was discovered in 1943, $50,000 prize. Down in southwest Florida, the Sunnyland oil well field, still marked with an old pumping jack there, discovered it, and we've been producing down there since. They claimed the prize, Humble Oil Company, a predecessor to what's now ExxonMobil, $50,000. They matched it. They gave half of it to Florida State College for Women, which is now FSU, the other half to the University of Florida. So I like to say that my industry has been a steward of our resources and involved in getting back to the state of Florida since it was found. So it's important to note that. And it's a lot of oil also. Next slide. These are some of the areas we produced it. It's a lot of oil to me, and maybe to you, I hope, as well. So we produced it, and in the 70s, we actually moved up to become the 9th largest producer in the country. So we've been producing, and is anybody a native Floridian? Great. Have you ever heard of an onshore production problem associated with my industry? Really, I mean, in the history of that, not legitimate. We've had a really good track record. And I'm proud of that. We need to be doing more of that. But if you look at it, we've produced about 611 million barrels of crude. That's about 24 billion gallons. Not an insignificant amount, 689 billion cubic feet of natural gas in a lot of different areas. And we've looked for oil in many different areas of the state, including Orange County, believe it or not. There's maps out there that'll show online at the Department of Environmental Protection and Oil and Gas online, show every well that was drilled in the state of Florida. Very interesting type stuff. So, how do we do it? We're pretty heavily regulated in the state currently. We're going to discuss where we may feel that there's some differences in what we've done so far historically and when they've been updated. And I'll concede it may be time for some updates, and we'll talk about some of those later. But we've got, why should I go through all the chapters? We've got enormous, and the slide's available, and this is just public record. You can look up the regs and the statutes that govern us and our activities. But that's just a list of some of the state statutes and rules. Next slide. I want to go quickly here. How am I doing on time? Am I about halfway done? Yeah. Okay. Okay. Okay with you, Jennifer? Time-wise? Okay, great. So there's other statutes that apply too, and reviews that are available by a multitude of state agencies. Most of them are listed up there, both state and federal agencies. So before a permit is issued, it is circulated to these agencies for comment, involvement, and action, and things like that. One of the things that I'm involved in was mentioned is the Big Cypress Swamp Advisory Committee. Big Cypress Preserve is an area where we've been producing for a long time. We want to do more, some in those areas. Companies are coming, private companies with private capital, looking for permits to do some more in there. It has representatives across the board. In fact, there was a representative from Jennifer's organization, a botanist, and she resigned at one of the meetings. So I think they may have replaced the botanist position, but there's considerable folks that are involved in that and looking at the procedures and safeguards and conditions to make recommendations to the state of doing that. I served at that early in my career, and it really was kind of a great permitting type of thing. You had to have some of these opposing or differing interests, I won't say opposing, differing interest individuals then ultimately trying to come up. And when you'd see out in the field where somebody wanted to be in the big cypress, and I'm talking about wading into areas and going to cypress stands interest, you'd see movement where somebody would say, a hydrologist would say, hey, there's a very specific type of plant that runs in this direction. We should move away from here. And you'd move over to an area. Now that was back when we had to go straight down, so it really was significant. But we ultimately came up with permits to be able to produce American oil and natural gas. It was very significant to us, as I said. So well construction is part of that. It's really, really key. So I brought a little graphic with me. I wanted to talk just real briefly about how a well is constructed, where we go, when we take the kind of activity that we do. So you start out with a big casing, okay? And that's about a 24-inch type of casing that goes down, and it'll go down, I get my eyes down here, it'll go down several hundred feet, down into the aquifer. And then what you do is you have to come back in with another casing, and as you do, and you get that down there, then you pump a layer of cement between that steel casing. So there's a layer of cement and one casing, and then you pump that down to make sure it's sealed till it all comes back up. And I'm talking in layman's talk, not engineering talk, and I'm not an engineer, but it's really important that this be done well. And then you do it again as you go deeper, okay? So you're going to go with a 13-inch steel intermediate casing up to 7,000 feet. So that you've got two layers all the way down to 7,000 feet of that casing, okay? And then you're going to go through, now this is really important. You're going to go through aquifers across the country. And this was depicted, this model, more associated with models of aquifers that are much more showing in there. But, you know, it's kind of, this shows 7,000 feet. The reality is the Florida aquifer, our drinking water supplies, are up here. They go down a couple thousand feet, and then below that, in parts of the state, they have a boulder zone that goes down maybe another 1,000 feet. Then you get into impermeable layers, really, really hard stuff, not karst limestone. If it's a limestone, it's like a marble, and you're going down through that, you're going down through that, and you're adding other layers and cement. Each time you're doing these layers of casing, and I won't speed through, till you get down in Florida, about 12,000 feet. Well, that's more than a couple miles. And then you can begin to kick out and do that horizontal stuff. So all the wells previously were straight down. Then they started going outward. Then they started going out and adding some additional pressure and an engineering technology we call hydraulic fracturing. So we do that down here. So we're removed about 2 miles from any significant water supplies to the state, okay? So it's really, really important to note that we're down here, and the aquifer's up here in this area. Now we have to go through it, so it's very important. But you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 layers of steel with layers of concrete in between that. It has to be done properly. Engineering is very, very critical to that, and it has to be done properly. And when it's done, and then ultimately you're going to try to release this oil and natural gas from that distance down in there, and we've done so successfully. So it's way down there, but that's the kind of essential. So when you get into hydraulic fracturing, this type of part of it, drilling the well, getting out there, takes about, a couple months, 2-3 months, just the drilling kind of portion of it. The hydraulic fracturing that you guys are talking about is really near the end, and it's generally a period of time about 72 hours of when you're putting in a mixture of water, mostly water, a little bit of a surfactant, and the mean name for that is a chemical, and if they spell them out, some of that, there's a lot of different ones. They need to be, they're regulated closely. And then you add something that is typically called boron, which is really an element that's used in ice cream. So it's important we're going down there. And the concern in many ways about what we're getting back up is associated with those chemicals that we're putting in. We're bringing out oil, which has got a lot of constituent chemicals to it that we need and we use for many of the products of our lives that we talked about, right? So we're doing that. So that's kind of a little bit about the well protection. One of the large concerns, and we'll get into this more, is about the transparency of those chemicals. So working with the environmental community in a big producing state initially, we came up with a plan and created a nonprofit, completely independent entity, and something that you can go online and check out called Frack Focus. It allows you to go in and look at the chemicals that are used in the well, And there are some, very, very few, and they're decreasing, that are marked with trade secrets. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. And they're not, they use those as proprietary type of movement. They've got their kind of code recipe of what was used. It wasn't done necessarily to hide anything from anybody at all. It was done to protect a proprietary formulation. But that is significant in that it's becoming less and less of a necessity as time passes on, because there are so many of them are becoming generic. So you see very, very few that are marked confidential anymore. We've had a lot of debate about that, but we're making a lot of progress, I think, and maybe we can get this thing done so that it's not as nearly as a concern. Transparency is very, very important, but it's not done to hide things from the public. It's done for commercial business purposes, of which we still believe in the United States. So a lot of people have talked about this, and we see things, but you know, the president hasn't been the biggest supporter of the oil and gas industry this past. Okay, and you see that. But let's take just a look at and see what some of his administration has said. The president says we should strengthen our position as the top natural gas producer. Not only can we provide safe, cheap power, but it can also help reduce our carbon emissions. We produce more natural gas than ever before, and nearly everyone's energy bill is lower because of it. Natural gas boom has led to cleaner power and greater energy independence. We need to encourage that. And the reason he knows to do that is through these kinds of engineering technologies when done properly. If you look at his Secretary of EPA, there's nothing inherently dangerous in fracking that sound engineering practice can't accomplish. You look at, going down the list of it, if you look at his Nobel Prize winning Secretary of Energy of the United States right now, and, Moniz, he says, I still have not seen any evidence of fracking per se contaminating groundwater. Hydraulic fracturing is something you can do in a safe way, according to Stephen Chu. Fracking's been done safely for many, many years. Sally Jewell, the Secretary of Interior. Ken Salazar, the former Secretary of Interior. There's a lot of hysteria that takes place right now with respect to hydraulic fracturing. My point of view, based on my own study of hydraulic fracturing, is that it can be done safely. It's been done safely hundreds of thousands of times. It's been done for over 1 million times. What's really made the big difference in the last 10 to 12 years associated with this engineering is the combination of that horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing. Fracking has been done for a long, long time, and it does work, and it is safe. Next slide. A couple more. EPA just finished a study that you paid for as taxpayers. It's several $1 million. Basically, we believe in just June that it reveals no evidence that fracking has any systematic impacts on groundwater, and that's a quote from it. So moving on, it's a big one. It's public. Read it. Look at it. It's this big. It uses water. It uses about 1%. But if you look at our other kinds of uses of water, we're a tiny, tiny portion, and we're getting better at it. We need to reduce the amount of water we use because it's a precious commodity. We're recycling it more. We're looking for substitutes for that, changing that, and the amounts are going on. We need to take care of it properly when we use it and go onward. I'm trying to wrap here. Back to trade secrets, too. They offer protection from competitors. The composition has to be divulged to the department. The affected parties can release a request through a judge. This is according to the last bill that almost got finished last year. And the chemical composition must be divulged to healthcare workers when responding to workplace incidents of OSHA. So it's pretty there. Tourism's growing. It's vital to us. We're an important part of that. We're getting ready to reach 100 million folks. Next slide. We're all about, I am, and most of the folks in my industry are as well, about all kinds of usage. Solar is one of those that's important. All of my children have gone into the jungles of Africa installing solar lighting with Solar Light for Africa. They're 6th generation kids. My family moved here when I was just a baby on my wife's side. We go back 6, 7 generations. And the kids are really proud of their Florida heritage. We like solar too. And the projections of it are positive when we talk about renewables. As you see, it's gonna grow significantly in that chart. Next slide. But what I like to do is also bring to light this slide. That's the growth of natural gas that's going to grow a lot too. And it's a significant amount. But what really will grab your attention is that's really shards. Now, what do I mean by that? If you look really, really closely, that last chart incorporated into this reflects the potential growth of solar. And you see it gets a little bigger there. But the reality is, ladies and gentlemen, that we're going to need my industry's product for a long time. Natural gas in particular is a lower carbon footprint. It has made a dramatic difference in our carbon footprint across America, and it can be done safely with engineering technologies. And the next ones that come, like hydraulic fracturing. So I'll kind of end there. I won't get into that. Just kind of emphasizes where we're going with regards to energy consumption, the kinds of it, and that are out there. And we'll save that for another night. What else you got for me? Anything? So, in closing, my industry is all about access to affordable energy, reliable sources of that, and getting it in a responsible manner. Properly regulated. We're more than willing to work with regulators and stakeholders like the Conservancy on issues. We've come very, very close. We're not there on doing this. There are folks that just want an absolute stop us. We don't think that's in our best interest as a country and as an industry for sure. And if you look at emissions, we're having a dramatic impact on the change of that. With regards to utilities in the United States, it's coming down. We're not alone in that, but certainly we're the biggest portion of that by far. So it has a direct impact on our carbon footprint in the United States, and we can do more. And I'll skip that. So I think I'm done there. I thank you for your time and your attention and your civility tonight. I look forward to hearing Jennifer's presentation and then interacting with you as best we can.
Fabulous. Thank you so much for inviting us here tonight. My name is, again, is Jennifer Hecker. I'm the Director of Natural Resource Policy for the Conservancy of Southwest Florida. And I'm going to be quite honest. This is an issue that 2.5, 3 years ago, you would have asked me if I'd be working on this. I'd say absolutely not. We don't do energy policy. This was not something even on our radar. We would occasionally inquire about, you know, what's the probability that fracking is going to come to Florida? We'd be told, never. It's not going to happen in Florida. All that changed for us, and I'll just explain our story and why we got involved with this issue and where we are now. So, you know, obviously you all are aware that Florida has a very unique environment here. We have many federally and state endangered species, including the endangered Florida panther, especially right in Southwest Florida. We have the Everglades, the Western Everglades. So it's a very sensitive ecosystem. We have large amounts of contiguous wetlands. We also have a very unique geology made of this karst limestone, made from ancient coral reefs. So the geology we have here in Florida is very different than other parts of the United States where these techniques are being used. And that's one of the things that we really want to highlight is, again, whether you agree or disagree with how fracking is being used nationally, what we're really trying to highlight is the concerns we have with it being used here in Florida. So as was mentioned earlier, that we do have a history of oil extraction in Florida in the 40s. That's when we first started production. We had the first producing oil well in the Sunnyland. That's all right. All right, and then in the 70s, the discovery of the Trend well, the J Trend up in the Panhandle, and in the 90s, we had the onset of horizontal drilling, and the language was added in 1996 about hydraulic fracturing. And then now we really see a renewed interest in expanded oil exploration in Florida. So we've had a history, but up to this point, primarily conventional extraction. And you already heard about the differences between conventional extraction and unconventional extraction. Tonight we're going to focus on unconventional extraction. So modern extraction techniques, we talked about horizontal drilling. With horizontal drilling, it is true that you have less pads at the surface, but you also have a situation where you utilize more fluid, including a lot more fresh water, and a lot of hazardous chemicals that are injected under high pressure underground. Those chemicals are used to either fracture rock or dissolve rock. So when you fracture rock, that's commonly referred to as fracking. That can be hydraulic fracturing or acid fracturing. Another technique that is being used here in Florida, because we have our softer, more porous limestone, is acid stimulation with fracking chemicals. Acid stimulation is designed to dissolve rock, so it's not truly fracturing rock, but it's still using the dangerous chemicals that are often used in traditional fracking. So that's why people are often confused. Well, wait a minute, I thought all of this was fracking. But to the industry, only those techniques that fracture rock are fracking, and this acid stimulation using fracking chemicals is not considered true fracking in their mind, but would be to the general public usually. So the risks and impacts. We learned a lot because we had a situation in Southwest Florida where we had the first documented case of hydraulic fracturing. We were able, because of the political climate at the time, to get information that normally would be withheld from the public that had been deemed trade secret. So what happens in Florida is that you can go in and get your permit for a conventional drilling operation, and then after you have the permit in hand, if you want to hydraulically fracture or use any other form of well stimulation to stimulate production, you submit what's called a workover notice. That notification itself can be deemed a trade secret. So that not only the chemicals are withheld, but even the fact that they're undertaking that technique can be deemed trade secret, so that the public, the local governments, would never know that that's occurring at a nearby well. That was one of the problems that we had at a well in Collier County. We were able to get those documents that normally would be withheld. We were in litigation, and we had a political climate where we had the state wanting to provide those to us. And we learned a lot about this technique of hydraulic fracturing. We also learned a lot about the acid stimulation. We found out that both had been employed at this same well site. And that really helped us to understand that we're not just dealing with fracking here. We're dealing with multiple types of well stimulation that use hazardous chemicals. And we're concerned about all of them, and we want all of them to be suspended until there is scientific study as to their impacts here in Florida, as well as meaningful regulation put into place to make sure that we don't have techniques being employed that are unproven in our unique geology that would put our aquifers at risk. So under state law right now, you have to show that you own or lease the minerals. You have to apply for that, again, that traditional drilling permit, and then you have to notify DEP of any workovers. There is no separate permit, again, for switching from what may appear to be a conventional extraction operation to using hydraulic fracturing, acid fracturing, or acid well stimulation. That's of great concern to us. We want the agency to have the regulatory authority to be able to say, wait a minute, you're using a different technique now. If we don't feel it's safe, we want to be able to review this. We want to be able to deny your usage of that technique if we feel that it's putting important resources at risk. We also have issues where it's not just these unconventional extraction proposals, but also sometimes conventional drilling can be inappropriate if it's located in the wrong area, if it's located in an extremely environmentally sensitive area. We have such a case right now with the Cantor proposal in Broward County, where they're proposing to put a conventional well, what appears to be a vertical well, in a water conservation area, which is part of the Everglades restoration projects. So, you know, obviously not an appropriate location for that type of drilling. We, again, at the Conservancy are concerned not only with any drilling operations that are inappropriately located, but also any that are using unproven methods. We also have large-scale exploration projects. So, of course, before you drill, there is seismic exploration to locate where the best places are to locate future drilling operations. And we have right now many large-scale proposals for that going forward. In Southwest Florida, we have one for 70,000 acres within the Big Cypress National Preserve. And we also have one directly north of the preserve for over 100,000 acres called the Tacala Seismic Exploration Project, which would go through wildlife conservation areas like the Dinner Island Wildlife Management Area, as well as private lands. It would put 8,800 shot holes into the ground, each 50 to 200 feet deep, and 5 pounds of explosives in each hole. And we are very concerned about the impacts potentially to groundwater and also to wildlife from this very impactful form of exploration. In the Big Cypress, they're using a different method with vibriosis buggies, commonly referred to as thumper trucks. In the Big Cypress, though, it's such a sensitive ecosystem. We're very concerned about these large, they're tons, they're huge trucks going over very flat wetlands. You could have rutting, you could have situations where our hydrogeologist is concerned that the thumping that goes 12,000 feet underground, creating vibrations, could create fractures in the cap rock, potentially causing permanent changes in the hydrology of those wetlands. So we're very concerned about the activities going into very sensitive areas and impacting the water, the wildlife in those areas. So this goes into a little bit about the unconventional, unauthorized activity at the Hogan Well site in Collier County in Southwest Florida. And in that operation, they were permitted to use 280 million gallons of fresh water from our artificial aquifer, which was our prime potable water supply source, for this operation annually. So that's equivalent to over 4,000 residences worth of water for one well. You can imagine if you start to replicate that level of water usage. They didn't end up using that much because partially that well was shut down as part of our legal action. We were able to get them to suspend operations and production at that well. But they were permitted, there's a consumptive use permit for that amount of water. And once you reserve essentially that amount of water in a permit, it affects other users, including public suppliers. So we're very concerned again about the impact of this on public supply sources. We feel for an industrial use that alternative water supply sources should be used, and that's something that we had hoped to see in legislation. There was also acid stimulation at the Hogan Well site. This is a list of the chemicals that were used. Many of them can be found on Frac Focus, which was mentioned earlier, which were listed as standard hydraulic fracturing fluids. Some of those are known carcinogens, and we have an actual list of those here that was excerpted from the permit materials, and you can see the highlighted ones in yellow that we were able to cross-link with the Frac Focus website. We also have oil drilling operations moving closer and closer to residential areas. This was a proposal that thankfully got stopped, but it was to put an oil rig, oil well, 1,000 feet from residences. So these residential areas are, areas that are rural right now. They are meant to be that way. They have dirt roads that are dead-ending into these agricultural areas. The residents specifically bought those houses enjoying that rural way of life. There are school children, there's no sidewalks. The school children use the roads to play in, to go down to the bus stop, to wait for their school buses. We are very concerned because the trucks that were to go to this well were to go right through these neighborhoods, and those residential neighbors were very concerned about having that heavy industrial activity right up so close to their areas. And that's when we learned that there really isn't any established buffers for this type of activity. And now that we have horizontal drilling, you can go down and under other areas. You may not control the surface rights, but if you control the mineral rights, you can go essentially under the surface right holders. And in the estates, for instance, a lot of those people do not control the mineral rights under their homes. So it's a new type of incompatibility. And with vertical drilling, it's more straightforward. You set the pad up over where you're trying to target. So you usually would control both, but with horizontal drilling, you can have these incompatibilities and these conflicts with other right holders. So then talking about the oil and gas bills from last year, our organization worked very hard, along with the league I know, to try to see meaningful legislation introduced to suspend all forms of well stimulation until they were studied and until there was meaningful regulation put into place. As was mentioned earlier, there are regulations around oil and gas, but those were, for the most part, put in decades ago around conventional extraction. So we need to update those regs. We need to address these new forms. If we want to prohibit them, we need to go ahead and look at, where is the science to support what the impacts are and how we can get more responsible drilling activities promoted in our state. So, we are not anti-drilling across the board, but we definitely are concerned about using up these unproven methods or putting drilling proposals in sensitive areas. And we wanted to suspend the use of these unproven methods immediately. We were unable to get legislation that would do that. It only would suspend and study the techniques that would fracture rock, not those that dissolve rock, not the acid stimulation that we referred to earlier. We actually, in going through this process, learned that the acid stimulation was more commonly done and is more likely to be pursued than the true fracking. And so the concern is that we have a piece of legislation that is only studying and suspending and regulating a form of fracking-like extraction that isn't likely to realistically be widespread, whereas the widespread type of extraction is being completely excluded from this bill. And we also have issues with the preemption in the bill and the fact that right now the state permitting process doesn't look at light, noise, truck traffic, incompatibilities of land use with adjacent land uses like residential neighborhoods. Those are things that are typically done through zoning at the local level. Well, the state had looked at preempting that, and we just saw that the bills were refiled today, and that they actually have broadened that exemption to really take away all the home rule authorities of local governments from being able to restrict or regulate these types of activities, which isn't appropriate because it's not redundant. The state doesn't address those issues, and it's appropriate for the local community to make decisions if it feels that this is or is not compatible with the quality of life that they're trying to promote. So we expect, if you can go back one. So we expect that next, this session, again, that we're going to see legislation as we actually saw today. It is confirmed now that it only addresses those techniques that fracture, not the acid stimulation. Therefore, it only studies and suspends fracturing, but not the acid stimulation that does not fracture, but instead dissolves. So that's a great concern to us, and we are very dismayed because this was an issue that we really made our bottom line, if you will, for last session of what we wanted the legislators to do. It's laying the foundation for proper regulation, and if you, for instance, have if you have a 1,300 square foot foundation, you're not going to be able to build a 2,000 square foot house on that foundation. We wanted to at least know that we were laying the proper foundation that included all forms of well stimulation that use fracking chemicals, and these bills unfortunately do not do that as of yet. The EPA study was mentioned, and I just wanted to say that it is very important to understand that the EPA study did not conclude that there was absolutely no impact from fracking. It just said that there were very limited instances. Well, even a 1% chance of contaminating an aquifer from our standpoint is a very huge, huge risk. It's not even known if you can decontaminate an aquifer, no matter how much money you have. So that's a big, big concern. Also, it's important to know that this study, not one of the examples, or it had absolutely no pertinence to Florida. There was nothing in that study that pertained to our unique geology and hydrology here in the state of Florida. It was all focused on other states, which have very different conditions than Florida. So all well stimulation, in our opinion, must be immediately suspended. We will not accept anything short of that. We will not accept only suspending fracking, but not acid stimulation with fracking chemicals. We also need that legislation must be built off the results of this study. We need to have informed science-based policy decisions. This is very important. As a former scientist, I feel very strongly that we need to focus on making sure that our policy decisions are rooted in strong science and facts. And it'll be very hard to, frankly, to get independent, solid science on this. So it's not just any scientific study, but robust, independent scientific evaluation of how these impacts could ensue from using these techniques. I will mention that the Conservancy, along with 4 other groups, Earthworks, Earth Justice, NRDC, and the Center for Biological Diversity, is proud that we're going to be co-hosting a national educational summit in Southwest Florida, October 27th and 28th. And to find out more information about it, you can just go to flfrackingsummit.org. Anyone is invited to attend it. We try to keep the costs extremely reasonable so that the average person can come. We're bringing in national speakers from Texas, California, Pennsylvania to talk about their experiences. We want people to understand what the potential risks and impacts are. Sorry, I feel like I'm going in and out. But anyway, we want people to understand the potential risks and impacts before they actually occur. We want to be preventative. We don't want to wait until it's too late, until something horrible happens, or until we are past that tipping point where we can really affect change. So we're bringing in the experts to talk about potential impacts to air, to water, how the laws work. There's a lot of federal exemptions, there's a lot of state exemptions around oil and gas. So there are limitations unless we can fix the laws. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about what we can do with the existing laws. And we really hope that all of you will consider attending that educational event. So the final slide I just want to say is basically this is a big risk versus reward. In 2013, Florida produced less than 1/10 of 1% of U.S. domestic oil. That is so when we're talking about energy independence, Florida is not really a main player in this debate. That is not what we're talking about here. There is a limited amount of oil production. It's in Southwest Florida a very poor grade oil, and it's considered heavy sour oil. Sorry, I think I'll just keep talking. But you know, the bottom line is we have very sensitive ecosystems here. We have a quality of life that's based on our environment. Our economy is based on our environment. We have to continue to maintain our quality of life to be a draw internationally and to ensure that we are preserving that makes us attractive for people outside of our state to come visit here, to come retire here, to buy homes here. If we squander that, we'll be losing far